I think most people don't wake up wanting to hurt other people, but here's the problem. If you have a job that involves enforcing the law in a society where the law is the problem, right? Let me repeat. If you have a job to enforce the law in a society where the law itself is the problem, that is to say segregation as a law, enslavement as a law, indigenous removal as a law, right? The dislocation and dispossession of Latinx peoples from their land, where that's a law, where Japanese internment is a law, right? Then the people whose job is to enforce that law by definition are agents of injustice. That's not about hating police. That's just obvious, right? If you are the enforcer of the system and the system is the problem, then you are part of the problem. If you want to be part of the solution, you got to flip that system. Right? You can't stand at the end of the conveyor belt in the factory marked sausage factory and be shocked when all the stuff it sends you is sausage. If you're sitting down there and you're like, where the hell are my chicken nuggets? You clearly did not read the sign, yo. It said it was about sausage. So you probably ought to understand the system is contributing and producing exactly what it was intended to produce. You know, Donald Trump thinks that you're so racist that you're going to fall for him blaming people who didn't cause these problems. It's almost like a way of saying to the person who actually might be racist, you know, it's almost like appealing to their better nature and saying, surely you're not going to fall for that. He's trying to manipulate you. He's trying to get you to think that the reason you don't have a job is because of Mexicans. But that's not true, and you know better than that, because there's actually some research which says that when people who actually do have bias, and we all have some, we've all been programmed to have it in this culture, one of the best ways to get people not to act on bias is to challenge them to rise to the better angels of their nature and treat them like people who are capable of doing right even when their inclination might be to do wrong. This particular moment, this particular man, this particular administration any more credit for creating this problem than he deserves, because this thing has been around since long before Donald Trump. This thing has been around long before Trumpism, right? We can't give all the credit there. It's not like Donald Trump thought up some new stuff. It's not like Donald Trump created the problem. This is a problem that goes back to the founding of our country. So we'll get to that. But I want to start somewhere else. If you don't understand, for instance, the history, the predicate, what came before when it comes to the subject of law enforcement misconduct in black and brown communities, for instance, right? If you don't know that history because it was never taught to you, right, then a movement like Black Lives Matter won't make sense to you. If you don't understand the way that black life has been discounted and denigrated and has not mattered institutionally to an awful lot of folks, right, then somebody proclaiming that Black Lives Matter will seem irrational. It will seem horribly militant and separatist and maybe even hateful. And then you'll say things like, but what about my life? What about me? All lives matter, don't they? What about me? I know, precious, I know your life matters. I know my life. You don't have to tell me that all lives matter. I get that. I got 2 children. I got 2 teenagers. They're 15 and 13. They are white. That is what happens when white people make babies. You get white babies. They are white. I know that their lives matter. You don't have to tell me. I don't need a bumper sticker to remind me of the value of my own children's lives. The point is, every cop in this country also knows that my daughter's lives matter. And every teacher knows. And every employer knows, and every bank loan officer knows. That is to say, we don't have to specify about my daughters. Their lives and the value of their lives are taken for granted. You only got to specify that which gets routinely ignored. You only have to specify that which we tend to forget, because remember, white folks have a long history of saying all and not meaning it. We do. Thomas Jefferson, now, it's not representative of all white people, but I gather he's one of white people's favorite white people. Thomas Jefferson said, did he not, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's that word all, as in all lives matter, all men are created equal. But when Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he owned over 250 other human beings, so I'm guessing he didn't really mean it. But he said it, right? And when the Pledge of Allegiance was written, first iteration in the 1880s, there were several afterward through the 1920s, last iteration, last version, 1954. But in every iteration of the pledge, what's that last line? That never changed. With liberty and justice for whom? All. There's that word again, written by white folks who I dare say in 1888 or whatever it was, did not mean it. Nor did they mean it in the 20s, nor did they mean it in the 50s. So what black folks are trying to tell us with BLM, whether we're prepared to hear it or not, is that when y'all have been forgetting that we're part of the all, we're going to have to remind you.
Born on third base, thinking you hit a triple, prepare to have your comfortable narratives shattered. Tim Wise, in a raw and unflinching address, dares to expose the systemic architecture of inequality that shapes our lives. This isn't just another lecture, it's a radical excavation of the American myth, a journey into the heart of a conveyor belt of injustice that churns out predictable disparities. Are you ready to witness the unraveling of the secular gospel of America and confront the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath our national mythology? Redlining shadows, war on drugs, illusions, and the asterisk that qualifies all lives matter. Wise dismantles the carefully constructed narratives that perpetuate racial and economic division. He challenges us to look beyond the surface, to trace the bright line relationship between historical oppression and contemporary inequality. From the legacy of slave patrols to the insidious manipulation of racial anxieties, he exposes the systemic forces that continue to shape the lived realities of black and colored majority communities. Can you stomach the truth about the privilege you didn't earn and the systemic disadvantages others endure? Divide and conquer tactics versus the shared vulnerabilities of the working class. Wise cuts through the noise of racial resentment and exposes the calculated strategies that pit us against each other. He confronts the illusion of a post-racial society, reminding us that the very need to assert Black Lives Matter underscores the persistent devaluation of black humanity. This isn't a call for guilt, but a demand for awareness, a challenge to recognize the algorithms of injustice that operate beneath the surface of our daily lives. Will you dare to question the narratives you've been told and confront the systemic realities that shape our society? The light bulb moments are about to ignite. From personal anecdotes that reveal the racialized dynamics of law enforcement to the dismantling of the myth of meritocracy, Wise invites us on a journey of radical empathy and transformative understanding. This isn't just about acknowledging the past, it's about dismantling the present and building a more just future. Are you ready to see beyond the illusion of individual achievement and embrace a systemic understanding of our society? Watch the full video and prepare to be transformed.
And Black Lives Matter becomes that asterisk at the end of white folks all. As in, yeah, y'all need to be reminded from time to time that you've been forgetting some folks. Now, we can certainly make the argument that we got to be clear that Indigenous lives matter and Latinx lives matter and Asian Pacific Islander lives matter, because those are too often discounted as well. But trust me when I tell you that in this country, when black lives finally do matter, at the institutional and systemic level, all of our lives will, and not one moment before that, see? But if you don't know the history of misconduct, nothing I said will make sense to you, because for a lot of white folks, we have grown up in a society where the police really were the protectors. We just had a different relationship to law enforcement than a lot of people of color have. This isn't about bad cops, good cops, by the way. It's not about, oh, all police are terrible, all police are racist, all police are brutal. It's not about people, it's about systems, right? And law enforcement as a culture has a history of abuse, and every Angelino who is black and brown knows that. Everyone in this greater area who is black and brown knows that. Everybody's been in Pasadena long enough knows that, right? Black folks, for instance, know that modern policing traces directly to slave patrols. That's the first iteration of policing in this country, right? And there's a bright line relationship between that and what came next. Cops were the ones who enforced the slave laws. Cops were the ones who enforced segregation. Cops were the ones who collaborated with riots in black neighborhoods, burning them to the ground in the 20s and 30s. Cops were the ones who collaborated with military uniformed officers in Los Angeles in 43 during the Zoot Suit riots when they rampaged in Chicano neighborhoods. And Chicano folks in this area know that history. A lot of white folks weren't taught it. And you can't know what you weren't taught, and you can't teach what you don't know. So I'm not saying you ought to feel bad for not knowing it. I'm just saying when you don't know some stuff, you miss some stuff. When you have the luxury of being oblivious to that history, you miss some stuff. People of color don't have the same luxury. They know that it was cops that pulled protesters off of the stools during the sit-ins in the South where I'm from. That wasn't done by random folk off the street. That was cops with guns and badges and the power of the state. See, here's the problem. Whether you're a good person or a bad person and you become a police officer, I think most people who become cops, most people who become teachers, most people who become whatever they become are good people. I think most people are good folks. Just in general, I think most people don't wake up wanting to hurt other people, but here's the problem. If you have a job that involves enforcing the law in a society where the law is the problem, Right? Let me repeat. If you have a job to enforce the law in a society where the law itself is the problem, that is to say segregation as a law, enslavement as a law, indigenous removal as a law, right? The dislocation and dispossession of Latinx peoples from their land, where that's a law, where Japanese internment is a law, right? Then the people whose job is to enforce that law by definition are agents of injustice. That's not about hating police. That's just obvious, right? If you are the enforcer of the system and the system is the problem, then you are part of the problem. If you want to be part of the solution, you got to flip that system, right? You can't stand at the end of the conveyor belt in the factory marked sausage factory and be shocked when all the stuff it sends you is sausage. If you're sitting down there and you're like, where the hell are my chicken nuggets? You clearly did not read the sign, yo. It said it was about sausage. So you probably ought to understand the system is attributing and producing exactly what it was intended to produce, right? And if you understand the history, that doesn't sound radical. It just sounds obvious, right? But if you don't know that history, it seems absurd. So you got to understand the past to understand the present. That's the point. But it's not just with regard to policing, right? It's with regard to just any inequities that you see. And I think about this not as an educator, not as a writer, not as a scholar, activist, or anything. I think about this as a dad, right? Because like I said, I got these two girls, they're 15 and 13. And, you know, when you're a parent, you always sort of pay real close attention to how your kids learn stuff, right? And you can see, like, when the light bulb goes on over their head, and it's sort of a really amazing moment because you're like, oh, my God, they just figured out something, and sort of cool, and, you know, you try to commit that to memory. All right, so a couple years ago, I'm driving with my girls to their dance studio. They're dancers, and we were leaving their school to drive to the studio, about 8 minutes on surface streets in Nashville, Tennessee, from their school to the downtown studio, where they were both in the company. And it's a drive we've made every day, virtually every day for like a year and a half during the week and once on weekends. So we're used to this drive, but on this particular day, something different happened. We get stopped at a red light. And that red light happens to be in the middle of public housing, right? Both sides of the street, public housing apartments, or what we refer to in this country as projects, right? And the 10-year-old daughter, whose name is Rachel, sitting in the back seat, looks around, and I'm sure she had recognized the racial demographic of that neighborhood before because we've been making the drive every day, right? But that day she says, Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? Oh, that's a hell of a good question, right? I mean, that's a really deep. Like my kid, my 10-year-old is doing like urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander, y'all. That's like some pretty serious stuff. Like I was very proud too, you know, because after all, this is what I do, right? And she's like noticing stuff and I'm like, oh, I'm so proud. And I'm real happy because it's like the one question she could have asked me that I actually know the answer to, right? Because when you're a parent, your kids will ask you all kinds of crazy shit that you have no idea how to answer. Like if my daughter had said, Daddy, where does electricity come from? I'd have been like, psh, Google it. I have no idea. I didn't pay attention in that class. But the one about how this neighborhood got black, I know that. That's the one. And so I'm all excited. I got the answer ready. I can't give her the PhD level answer because we only got 4 minutes left before we're at the studio, right? So I know I got to cut it down. I got to make it sort of easy. You know, I got to make it digestible, right? So I've got the thumbnail version, though. It's right here in my throat. It's about to come out. And then something happened that I didn't know was going to happen because I'm an only child, right? I didn't know this was a thing, but those of you who are not only children will instantly recognize what I mean. Apparently, when you have an older sibling, and you are in the presence of that older sibling, and you ask a question of your parent, right, and the older sibling hears the question, they will inevitably, and without very much hesitation, offer up their own damn answer, right, just to show how smart they are. Right? And so Rachel says, remember the question, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? And Ashton, the 12-year-old, without missing a beat, as I'm getting ready to offer the answer, jumps up and says, redlining, which is scary-ass accurate if you know the history. And if you don't, you're about to. I was like, what? How did you know that? Have you been reading my books? Like, what? Is it genetic? Do you just know shit? Is it passed down generationally to you just because daddy knows? That's crazy. It was creepy. And the 10-year-old said, I don't think I know what redlining means. I'm like, yeah, I don't think your sister does either, but that was a hell of a guess. Right? Now, here's the thing. To be honest with you, her answer is not quite right. She Sort of got it twisted a little bit because redlining is not how it got black, but it is how it got poor. So she's sort of conflating race and class, but I'm going to give her half credit because, damn, she's 12 years old at the time. But let me just sort of explain to you what redlining is. Redlining is a thing that some of y'all will know what this is, but in any event, it was something that was very common. It was done as a matter of course all through this country, north, south, east, west, everything in between, where banks would take maps of neighborhoods and they would take a red marker and they would draw a line around black neighborhoods, and occasionally they would do the same with Latinx neighborhoods, but especially black neighborhoods. And anybody who lived in the boundaries of that neighborhood was not going to get a loan. You weren't going to get a business loan. You weren't going to get a mortgage loan, nothing. And it didn't matter if you had good credit, didn't matter. Didn't matter if you had a good job, didn't matter. Didn't matter if you had a good education, none of it mattered. You weren't getting a loan just because you lived in that space. And this was done generation in and generation out as a formal and totally legal above-board practice until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. But even after that, the research tells us it continued indirectly, sort of informally, secretly. The research today says we probably got 3 to 4 million cases of housing discrimination against people of color every year based on race. About half of those are in the mortgage market. The other half are in the rental market. So in other words, it's still happening. But it used to be totally legal. And as a result, right, that meant that those communities were starved of wealth. Those communities were starved of capital, right? Folks weren't able to start up businesses. And by the way, at the very same time they couldn't get those loans, they were knocking down neighborhoods to put up interstates and to put up shopping malls and to put up garages and office buildings. And most of the houses that got knocked down and apartments that got knocked down were being lived in by black and brown folks. 20% of all African-American housing in the country was knocked to the ground between 1950 and 1969 to make way for economic progress, highways, etc. Right? So people of color were being denied capital, and the stuff they already had was being flattened by bulldozers. Right? So that's how those neighborhoods became poor. But how did they actually become black or black and brown combined, folks of color? Well, that happened for a couple of reasons that are really important to know. First of all, most people don't know this history, but like Baldwin said, if you don't understand it, right, then you're not going to understand what you see. That's the effect of what he was saying in that quote I started with. What happens is the public housing that we were looking at right there in Nashville, and this is true public housing nationwide, that was created not for people of color. Most people don't know this history, but you need to. Public housing was created for white folks. Right? For the first couple of years, it was very hard in most parts of the country for people of color to even get access to publicly subsidized housing. It was created for poor white folks to give them an opportunity, a leg up to come into the so-called middle class. But at the very same time that the government creates those public interventions in the housing market for white people, they also created some other programs that were sort of duplications of that, but even better. They create the FHA loan program, the VA loan program, later on the GI Bill program. In theory, these were open to everybody, but in practice, virtually all the benefits went to white folks because the criteria to qualify for these loans, which were government guaranteed loans, loans without which you could not have gotten a house in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Virtually all the benefits went to whites because the underwriting criteria, the lending criteria, essentially excluded almost all people of color, with just a few exceptions. So in other words, the neighborhoods became racially identifiable because certain folks were able to hustle it out to the suburbs using those loans, right? Leaving the ones who couldn't get the loans in the city. And then you couldn't get a loan in the city because of redlining and other forms of discrimination. So these neighborhoods become white, these become black and brown, these become middle class to affluent, these become poor, not because of anything having to do with the people that live there, but having to do with the decisions made by people who most definitely do not live there, right? Now, I get to the end of that story and we're at the studio. I drop the kids off and I'm wondering, God, I hope they got it, you know? They seem to. They're nodding. They're, oh, yeah, okay. They seem to understand, yeah? And as I'm driving away, I think to myself, that's a really important story because what if my kids ask me that and I don't know the answer? What if your kids ask you and you don't? What if a child asks a teacher in a classroom and they don't because they were never taught it? Because were any of us really taught in K-12 about that process of racial discrimination? I wasn't. I wasn't taught in AP history, and hell, that's the history for smart people. That's what they tell you. That's the history where you can supposedly handle anything. Apparently not that, though. You can't handle that. So they don't tell you that, right? And if I don't know the answer, do you think my kid stops wondering about the question? No, see, my 10-year-old who wanted to know why the neighborhood looked the way it did, right, is going to keep wondering. But if she asks and I'm like, oh, I don't know, she's going to keep wondering, what do you think her conclusion is going to be? Because she's going to come to her own conclusion. And you know what that conclusion is going to be. The only one it can be in this culture. It's the conclusion that this society has already handed her on a silver platter. What is it? You know, because it's the conclusion that comes from the fundamental guiding ideology of our country, the thing that we've all been taught, the thing that we've all been exposed to, the secular gospel of America, the creation myth of America, Genesis 1:1 of America. And you know what it is. The Genesis 1:1 of this country is what? Wherever you end up is all about you, right? Because if you just worked hard, you'd have made it. If you didn't make it, there's something wrong with you. You should have worked harder. The notion of rugged individualism, right? That's the fundamental building block of our country. But if you're taught that, and then you look around and you see this level of inequality and you don't know the backstory of how we got that inequality, then you end up defaulting to the idea that these people are down here living like this because there's something wrong with them. And these people over here are up here living like this because they're superior. In other words, racism becomes almost rational unless you question that ideology. Just like sexism does. Right? Because if you look around and you see men disproportionately on the hierarchy, right, and you see women disproportionately below them on that hierarchy, then it becomes almost logical for people, even women, to internalize a belief that they don't have the same capacity as men. Classism becomes rational, where you look down even on poor white folks. You look down on poor white folks in coal country and Appalachia, you go, well, you know, if they would just work harder, everything would be fine. We don't have to do anything to the job market or the larger economy because they're to blame. In other words, if we don't understand how we got from point A to point B to point whatever we're at now, we end up making conclusions that are fundamentally going to reinforce racism, sexism, and classism. And here's the thing. Every one of us knows that that myth is a myth. We know it's not about simple, rugged individualism. We all know people, do we not, who have worked hard their whole lives, got nothing to show for it. And we all know people who were born on third base and think they hit a triple, right? Never had to work hard. Right? And they'll never lose what they've got. I'm even told, now this may be a rumor, y'all tell me, but I was told, as hard as this may be to believe, that there are even people who inherited their father's real estate empire in the 1970s, got to take over his real estate portfolio in the 1970s when it was worth $227 million already, and turned it into a few billion and decides that that makes him a self-made billionaire. Have y'all heard that story? I heard that story. I don't know who I'm talking about. I forget the name, but I feel like that's a thing, right? We know it's not about rugged individualism. It's about head starts, who had them and who didn't. It's about an 8-lap relay race where some folks started on lap 5, and some folks had to start at lap 1, and then were shocked when the ones with the 5-lap head start crossed the finish line first. That's what's supposed to happen when you have a 5-lap head start. Yes? Right? And so ultimately and look, the rugged, first of all, like even if you don't like my politics, can we just agree that there's no such thing as a rugged individual? That's like some crazy shit. Like really, truly crazy. Because what would that even entail? First of all, there's no such thing as an individual human being. Right? Because humans have always lived in collectives. We are a social being. We're a social species. None of us were raised by ourselves on an island by a porpoise. Right? We've had families, we've had tribes, we've had cultures, we've had nations, right? We've all been raised in a social context. None of us were raised by a porpoise on an island. If you ever actually meet someone who qualifies as a true rugged individual, for the love of God, you need to get the hell away from that thing. Because it's going to be dangerous as hell. It's going to be like a feral animal. It's not going to have language, right? It's not going to know that it's not supposed to eat you because nobody ever told it that, right? Because it was a rugged individual being raised by the porpoise on the island. They see you, they're like, I'm just going to eat you. They don't know. Rugged individuals will be dangerous. You don't want them running your country. You don't want them running your business. You don't want them as neighbors, right? The good news is there aren't any such people. We've all had help. We've all been raised in a social context. We have to understand that context in order to understand how we arrived at our current position and at our current place, right? And it's very dangerous for us not to do that, right? It's dangerous when we think about the policing thing again. I can tell you right now, the only reason I'm standing here. See, if I'm going to ask you to think about that, how you ended up from point A to point B, I got to do the same. So I'll model the behavior I'm asking about. Because once again, this is where privilege comes in. This is where we have to understand the context of our own lives. I'm only standing here because the war on drugs is not about drugs. Right? Going back to that issue of policing. I'm only here because the war on drugs isn't really about the thing it pretends to be about. What do I mean by that? I think you know what I mean by that. And I can tell you what I'm about to tell you because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit and they can't touch me now. I'm being quite serious. Keep in mind now, the reason I know the war on drugs isn't about drugs, two things. One is all the data tells me. Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes on Drug Abuse, every study you choose to consult says what? White folks are just as likely, if not more likely, to use drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to possess drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to sell drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, than people of color to become addicted to them, right? So the rates of usage, possession, dealing, and addiction equal or greater, depending on the age group for whites, relative to people of color. That's one way that I know. The other way is the fact that I'm here. Because in April of 1988, I was headed back from a college debate tournament. I was at Tulane University in New Orleans. We went to a debate tournament in San Antonio, driving a rental car back, right? And I get stopped in Gonzales, Texas. I do not recommend this, by the way. I get stopped in Gonzales, going about 13 miles an hour over the limit. So I pull over. It's just me, my debate partner, another two-person team, and the coach. And I'm nervous, right? And I'm nervous because I know what's in the car, other than debate evidence. I know that at that moment, in the briefcase of my coach, is the following: 1.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of coke, 12 sheets of acid. Yeah, Google it, and 14 hits of X. Now, not bragging, by the way, and I'm not encouraging this behavior. Yeah, I'm not. I'm just asking you a fundamental question. You know what the question's going to be, but I got to keep setting this thing up. Now, for those who are not drug users, either now or at any point, that is not for personal consumption, as you can probably imagine. That would kill anyone who tried to do all that. So that was my coach. He was a dealer on the debate circuit. He would deal to other coaches. He would deal to debaters, right? So I get pulled over, and I know that's in there. And I'm nervous as hell because he comes to the door with that flashlight, right? Puts it in the face, and he's like, I need to see your license. I'm like, of course. I'm looking for it. I'm looking for the damn thing. It's a wallet. It's got like 4 places it could be. Can't find the damn thing. And it seemed like it took 30 minutes. It was probably 20 seconds. But it seemed like it was a half an hour. I'm sweating, right? My eyes are getting big. I'm sweating crazy, just profusely. The air's on, doesn't matter. Sweating, right? And I just know that this is not going to go well. He says, would you like to come back and sit in the cruiser where the light's better? I'm like, okay. I go back there. He's right, man. The light is way better in the police car. So I'm looking for it. Right? And finally, I turn over this one little, flap where you put pictures and credit cards and stuff. And there's my fake ID. I got that. He sees it. He goes, isn't that it? I'm like, no. That's something else. I don't know. That's like a craft project. I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know, even though it said driver's license right on the damn top. And he saw it, and he's like, are you sure? And he starts to reach for it. And just as he starts to reach for it, now keep in mind, just the license alone is a misdemeanor offense, $500 fine, up to 60 days in jail potentially. Probably wouldn't have gone to jail for it, but they're going to search the car when he gets it, right? So he's reaching for it. And just as he does, I find my real license that magically reappears in a place that I thought I had searched 5 times. And I'm like, here it is. Oh, here it is, right? And he goes, you sure that's it? And he gave me a look that said he knew. He writes me a $75 ticket. He lets me go. Now, if you think that he wouldn't have searched that car with all the nervousness that I was exuding, the at least suspicious behavior that would suggest possibly something greater was up. If you don't think he would have searched that car if I were black or brown, you have not been paying attention. And I don't mean to this lecture. I mean to life in general in America, right? So see, that doesn't take away from whatever genuine abilities I have as a speaker or as a writer or as a scholar or as a whatever, right? but it means that every one of us is where we are because of a confluence of factors, some of which have to do with privilege that we didn't earn, some of which are just about luck. Because the other reason I'm standing here is even stranger than that one. The reason I'm really standing here is because right after I graduated from college, I got a job in Louisiana working against a white supremacist neo-Nazi former Klan leader named David Duke, who was running for the U.S. Senate and governor in Louisiana in 90 and 91. All right, I was involved in the campaigns against him. It was sort of a high-profile thing, so those of us who worked in that effort got a lot of attention, probably more than the person who's 23 years old typically would have doing this work. But the only reason I got to do that job was because I'd gone to Tulane and I met the two men who started that organization. If I go to any other college, I don't meet them, right? And the only reason I went to Tulane is because when I came out of high school, I was chasing a girl that went to Louisiana State, right? That's the truth, right? I never even thought of Tulane, but I meet this girl at a summer debate camp. I realize I'm totally like geeking out on debate right now, but you just got to understand these are important stories, you know, central to my life. I was at a debate camp at American University in D.C. summer between junior and senior year. I meet this girl, and in the manner of a 16-year-old, I fall in love, right? And I tell her I'm going to go to Emory in Atlanta. That was where I was going to go. She's like, no, you can't go to Atlanta for college. We'll never see each other. You have to go to Tulane because then you'll only be an hour away, hour and 15. And then I'm like, oh, of course, I will completely change my entire life. Of course, that's what I'm going to do. Naturally, that's what I'm going to do. Screw my entire life plan. I'm following you because those relationships always work out. And I'm not bitter, by the way. It worked out really well for me and for her separately, but, you know. But if I don't meet her and she doesn't convince me to go to Tulane, I don't meet those men. And if I don't meet those men who start that organization, I don't get that job. And if I don't get that job fighting David Duke, my whole life goes in a fundamentally different direction. But here's the thing. The only reason I met her was because I was a debater. If I hadn't been a debater, I wouldn't have done that. The only reason I was a debater was because, and that hadn't been my plan either. That hadn't been my path. At least I didn't think. When I was a kid, I thought my path was baseball. I was a really good baseball player. Not as good as Donald Trump now, because you've heard Donald Trump wants you to know he was the best baseball player in New York City in 1962. That happens to be a year that the Yankees won the World Series, but he was better than all of the players on the Yankees. He literally said this. So I wasn't Donald Trump good, but I was good. And I thought, I had college scouts come into my games when I was like 11 or 12, and so I thought, man, that's going to be my path. But then tried out for the high school team, had the most inexplicably horrible tryout in the history of tryouts. It's like I couldn't catch anymore. I couldn't throw. I forgot all the rules of the game. I get cut and had to find a different activity, which became debate. If I make that team, I'm not going to be debating. I'm going to be playing ball. If I'm not debating, I don't meet Monica at American University. I don't end up at Tulane. You know the rest of the story. What I'm really trying to tell you is I owe everything to that asshole that cut me from the baseball team. And to Coach Cantrell, I say thank you. Well played, because that ultimately made the difference. The point I'm trying to make is we got to challenge this notion of meritocracy. This idea that we end up where we are just because of our own hard work and our own effort, right? That's not true for me, as I've just proven. It's not true for any of us. Anywhere we get in life, we've had help. Some of it's been about race, some of it's been about gender, some of it's been about class, and some of it, like the baseball story, is just about luck, right? And if we'd be willing to own that, we'd be quite a ways further towards challenging racism, sexism, classism, and all these forms of inequality, because we wouldn't be looking down on folks who hadn't made it yet. Right? Because we could see ourselves in them and we could see them in us. It's only when we separate ourselves. Same thing is true with the immigration debate, right? Think about this. Our inability to understand the history of our own as white people, immigration is what gets us all twisted about brown folk coming, right? Because when Donald Trump gets up and says, well, you know, Mexico, they're not sending their best. The hell, you think England sent their best? Y'all do know the best don't leave, right? The best sort of stay where they're at because they're winning. That's sort of the whole point. Like if you're the best, you ain't getting on the boat, right? I mean, the best are already, why the hell would they leave, man? They got everything they want. It's not like sometime around 1642, there's some British nobleman that gets his family together around the fireplace in the big castle and goes, all right, I've been giving this some thought, you know, and I've consulted with your mom, not much, because it's like 1642, and I don't even have to ask her a damn opinion. But We've been talking about it, and I think even though, I know you like the castle, right? It's great, right? I know, it's brilliant, it's great. I know, it's fantastic. You remember last weekend we were at the King's? I know, right? You like the King's children, right? They're fabulous. I know you're out there riding on the ponies. We got all this gold. We do all these great things that rich people do in 1642. It's fantastic. But to hell with all that. I've got an idea. And we've decided that in 2 weeks from now, we're going to ask you to gather up your things. Just gather up your things. Just all that you can carry. Nothing else. Just gather up your things. And we are going to get on a boat.
Wise begins by dissecting the deliberate orchestration of racial anxieties, the calculated deployment of divide and conquer tactics that obscure the shared economic vulnerabilities of working-class Americans, yet simultaneously weaponize racial resentment against black and brown communities. He dismantles the convenient illusion of a post-racial society, reminding us that the very necessity to assert Black Lives Matter underscores the persistent devaluation of black humanity, a stark testament to the ongoing struggle for recognition and dignity. This isn't a mere rhetorical exercise. It's a confrontation with the historical amnesia that systematically erases the systemic roots of present-day disparities, the deliberate obfuscation of the past to maintain the present power structures that continue to oppress colored majority communities. He challenges the audience to confront the uncomfortable truth that racial inequality is not a relic of the past, but an active ongoing process, a continuous cycle of systemic oppression. The narrative then plunges into the historical bedrock of racialized power, tracing the lineage of contemporary policing to the institution of slave patrols, a stark reminder that the very foundation of law enforcement in this country is built upon the enforcement of racial hierarchy, a system designed to control and subjugate black bodies. He challenges the comfortable dichotomy of good cops and bad cops, arguing that even well-intentioned individuals become agents of injustice within a system designed to maintain racialized order, a system that consistently targets and criminalizes black and brown individuals. The conveyor belt of systemic oppression, he asserts, produces predictable outcomes, regardless of the intentions of those who operate it. A metaphor for the relentless machinery of inequality that churns out disparities with alarming consistency, disproportionately impacting colored majority communities. He urges the audience to consider the systemic nature of policing, and to recognize that individual actions are often shaped by the larger institutional context, a context that perpetuates racial bias and discrimination. Wise's personal anecdotes, interwoven with his incisive analysis, serve as potent illustrations of the insidious nature of privilege, the often invisible advantages that shape our life trajectories yet remain inaccessible to black and brown individuals. The story of his traffic stop in Texas, a moment of stark realization about the racialized dynamics of law enforcement, lays bare the selective application of justice, the stark contrast between his experience and the likely experience of a black motorist in the same situation. He deconstructs the war on drugs, revealing its disproportionate impact on black communities, a testament to the fact that policy does not always equal justice, but often serves to reinforce existing power structures, criminalizing and incarcerating black individuals at alarming rates. He encourages the audience to examine their own experiences and to consider the ways in which privilege has shaped their lives, while acknowledging the systemic barriers faced by colored majority communities. Tim's recounting of his own career trajectory, a series of seemingly random events, culminates in a powerful indictment of the myth of meritocracy, the comforting illusion that success is solely the product of individual effort, an illusion that ignores the systemic barriers faced by black and brown individuals. He dissects the notion of rugged individualism, exposing its inherent absurdity and highlighting the often invisible scaffolding of privilege that undergirds narratives of self-made success, the unearned advantages that pave the way for certain individuals while denying opportunities to others. The phrase "born on third base" becomes a potent metaphor for inherited advantage, a challenge to the self-congratulatory narratives of those who reap the rewards of systemic inequality, oblivious to the structural forces that shape their destinies and deny opportunities to colored majority communities. He forces the audience to confront the uncomfortable truth that success is often a product of circumstance, not just merit, particularly for those who have been historically disadvantaged. He then digs deeper into the historical context of housing discrimination, explaining the lasting effects of redlining, the systematic denial of loans and investment to black neighborhoods, which created enduring patterns of poverty and segregation, trapping generations in cycles of disadvantage. This part of the speech is particularly crucial as it demonstrates how policy, rather than individual choice, can create lasting social disparities, how the deliberate actions of those in power can shape the lives of entire communities, denying them access to wealth and opportunity. The fact that neighborhoods were created, not by the choices of the people who lived there, but by the calculated decisions of those who did not, underscores the systemic nature of inequality, the ways in which power operates to maintain its own dominance, particularly in colored majority communities. The personal story of his daughters, and their innocent question about the racial makeup of a neighborhood, highlights the importance of understanding history to comprehend the present. the necessity of context to make sense of the world around us, particularly for black and brown children who are forced to navigate a society shaped by historical and ongoing racism. He stresses that without that understanding, people will inevitably make false assumptions based on the prevailing social narratives. Wise dismantles the myth of the rugged individual, emphasizing the inherently social nature of human existence, the interconnectedness of our lives, particularly for those who belong to marginalized communities. He argues that our successes and failures are inextricably linked to our communities and our histories, and that the illusion of individualism serves to obscure the systemic nature of inequality, the ways in which power operates to maintain its own dominance, particularly in colored majority communities. He urges the audience to recognize the collective nature of our existence and to embrace a more systemic understanding of our society, particularly in relation to the ongoing struggles of black and brown individuals. He urges us to confront our own biases, to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality, and to work towards a more just and equitable future, a society that lives up to its ideals, particularly for black and brown individuals. His message is ultimately one of hope, but a hope grounded in a clear-eyed understanding of the challenges we face, a recognition of the systemic nature of inequality, particularly for colored majority communities. He believes that by confronting our history and by challenging the myths that sustain inequality, we can create a society that lives up to its ideals, a society that truly embodies the promise of all, regardless of race or ethnicity. Wise's words resonate with a sense of urgency, a call to action that is both timely and timeless, a demand for change that transcends the limitations of individualistic thinking, particularly for those who are committed to racial justice. He compels us to see past the surface and to acknowledge the systemic roots of inequality, and he inspires us to work towards a more just and equitable future, a future where the promise of equality is not just a myth, but a reality for all, particularly for black and brown individuals. He is calling for action, not just thought. In conclusion, Tim Wise's address is a powerful and thought-provoking exploration of race, class, and privilege in America, with a particular focus on the implications for black and colored majority communities. He challenges us to confront our own biases, to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality, and to work towards a more just and equitable future. His words are a call to action, a reminder that the fight for justice is an ongoing struggle, and that we all have a role to play in creating a better world, a world where the asterisk is finally erased, and the promise of equality is realized for all.